fee. Move to the economy.
My honor at this time to introduce the student office in association. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the International Military Student Office, in association with the Command and General Staff College Foundation and Army University, thank you for joining us today for our first presentation in the Know Your World Cultural Engagement Series for the class of 2027. First, a couple of announcements. Please do at this time silence your phones. Also, if during the presentation your spouse or your significant other or your child gets a little bit out of line, you can take them to the atrium in the back until they're ready to return. And after the presentation, we do ask that you please join us out in the atrium to have a culinary sampling from our country today, the Republic of France. It is my honor at this time to introduce to you our partner from the honored 2nd Marine Infantry Regiment of the French Armed Forces, Major Charles Henri Marie Allegre. This is Know Your World, France.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I have the modest task of explaining France in about 45 minutes, which is obviously impossible. So instead, I propose something more French, a 5-course meal. We'll start with a little geography, move to the economy, add a rather complicated culture salad, slow cook about 2,000 years of history, and finish with strategy. And like any proper French meal, it may take longer than expected, involve an argument somewhere in the middle, and leave you wondering why the bill is so damn high. But hopefully, by the end, France will make a little more sense. So, bon appétit. Our first course is geography. France is geographically spoiled. Mountains, plains, Atlantic coast, Mediterranean coast, forests, farmland, vineyards, yes, we got it all. But rather than describe it, let me give you the 60-second tourist brochure version first. After that, I promise to ruin it with PowerPoint.
CGS, it has just begun. You're sitting here missing all the fun. So close your eyes and dream of France, that is the prize. We've got beaches where sun shines like gold, mountains standing proud, ancient and bold, forests keeping quiet, green as far as you see, and elegant cities full of history. Whatever you're dreaming, we'll set the scene, more beautiful than you've ever seen. Rolling green hills and the sky so bright, lavender fields blooming in purple light, a sunny paradise waiting for you tonight. Oh, c'est la vie, leave the doctrine behind. A little bit of sun, a little glass of wine. Forget the maps, forget the test. Come to France, mon ami, and take a rest. No briefings there, no clock to obey. Mornings stretch long, no one counts the day. Savoir-vivre means taking your time. A table, a friend, a glass of good wine. That's our doctrine, simple and true. The kind, mon ami, that was made for you. Stroll through the market without any care. Feel the warm breeze flowing in your hair. Life is sweet and easy when you are there. Ratatouille simmering, no need to hurry. Fresh baguette on the table, no need to worry. Pour the wine, let the evening unwind. Leave the books and the deadlines behind. Mon ami, hold on, the wait's almost done. Come to France, I promise it'll be fun. Crisp buttered croissants, fresh from the tray. Savory crepes to brighten up your day. Just one little bite and you will want to stay.
Beautiful, isn't it? That was the France our Ministry of Tourism would like you to remember. Now, because this is CGSC, naturally we need to turn it into a map exercise.
First critical intelligence requirement for our dear American friends. Can you find France? This is an individual assessment. A, B, C, D, E. Take a minute. Now, B. If you chose something else, don't worry. We have an entire academic year to work on your European situational awareness. France occupies a rather useful piece of real estate, Atlantic to the west, Mediterranean Sea to the south, mountains on borders, and right in the middle of Western Europe. But maps can be deceptive. Americans in particular have a very reasonable follow-up question. How big is it? Same game. Which silhouette is roughly France? And remember, in Europe, France is a large country. In America, maybe you'd call it a county. France is roughly the size of Texas. Texas is somewhat larger, but this gives you the right order of magnitude. So by American standards, France is not particularly large. Then again, by American standards, nothing is. But before we leave geography, one more question. With which country does France share its longest land border? Is it Germany? Belgium? Spain, maybe? Nah, Brazil, obviously. Which is probably not the answer you expected, and it brings us to a part of French geography that is very easy to forget. France does not end in Europe. France has territories in the Caribbean, South America, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and even just off Canada, because apparently we were unwilling to leave North America entirely. Let's start with South America. French Guiana is particularly interesting. It is legally part of France, which means that the European Union has a land border with Brazil. And from here, Europe launches space rockets. These territories give France genuinely global geography and a very large maritime footprint. But maintaining a global presence requires something rather less romantic than beaches and tropical islands. Money. Which brings us to our second course. The stereotype is fairly straightforward. Wine, cheese, luxury goods, tourism, all true. But we also build nuclear reactors, satellites, high-speed trains, submarines, airlines, and fighter aircraft. So yes, we make great cheese. We also make jet engines. Occasionally, both industries involve strong smells and government subsidies. So what does the French economy actually look like beneath the stereotypes? Don't try to read every number here. There will not be a test. There are really three things I want you to remember. First, France is a major advanced economy. Overwhelmingly services, but very, very important industrial capabilities in aerospace, defense, energy, transportation, and luxury goods. Second, the state plays a much larger role than most Americans are accustomed to. About 1 employee in 5 works in the public sector, and taxes and social contributions are extremely high. And lastly, that model has a price. We have high public debt, persistent deficits, and structural unemployment. So here we are. Productive, wealthy, and technologically advanced economy carrying a very expensive social and government model. And despite all our complaints about globalization, and we do complain professionally, we do a great deal of business with one country in particular, you. France and the United States are not just allies. We are deeply connected economically. And look at what France actually sells to the United States on the left column. Yes, wine is there, perfume is there, luxury goods are there. We have a national reputation to maintain. But the biggest categories also include machinery, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, electrical equipment, and medical technology. In other words, the commercial relationship is considerably less Emily in Paris and considerably more industrial than the stereotype suggests. And it works both ways. The United States is one of France's most important trading partners. So our relationship is strategic, military, cultural, and commercial. But what if we took this special relationship one step further? Welcome to the state of France. 68 million inhabitants, which would immediately make us the most populous state in the Union. Economically, we would also be near the very top, but not in GDP per inhabitant. That's a trade-off. Life expectancy, very good. Income equality, very good. Homicide rate, low. Taxes, number 1, by a comfortable margin. So congratulations, you have acquired a rich, safe, heavily taxed state whose inhabitants immediately demand 5 weeks of vacation and a 35-hour work week. And before anyone asks, no, we are not giving you the cheese separately. That's part of the accession package. But this comparison tells us something useful. France is not a superpower, but neither is it a small European country. It sits in that interesting middle category, large enough to possess significant resources and capabilities, but small enough that it constantly has to make choices about where and how to use them. That tension will matter later.
But economics only tell you what France has. To understand what France is, unfortunately, we now have to talk about the French. And I apologize in advance. Charles de Gaulle supposedly asked, how can you govern a country that has 258 different cheeses? France likes to present itself as one country, one republic, one language, one people. The reality is considerably messier. But before discussing what divides the French, we should probably start with the 3 words that are supposed to unite us: liberté, égalité, fraternité. These 3 words are everywhere in France, on schools, town halls, government buildings, and even on our coins. But they are more interesting than a simple national motto. They are a roadmap. Liberty says, let me succeed, let me create, let me take risks, let me reach for the stars. Equality in the middle answers, yes, but nobody gets left behind. And occasionally, come back down here. And fraternity is standing behind them saying, could everyone please stop fighting? That tension between individual liberty, social equality, and national solidarity runs through French politics and society. Americans tend to place enormous emphasis on liberty, or freedom, as you like to call it. France does too, but equality has a much stronger claim on French imagination. So when French people argue about taxation, pensions, education, somewhere behind the argument you will often find these 3 ladies still arguing. National motto is less a solution than a permanent quest for the right trade-off. Of course, lofty Republican ideals are one thing. Then there are the French people who are supposed to live by them. And apparently, you have developed some opinions about us. All right, let's connect some myth-busting. French people are rude, not vindicated. We are not rude. We simply don't believe that every human interaction requires enthusiasm. But yes, we do swear more. French people never work, partly vindicated. We work fewer hours than Americans, but productivity remains high. The objective is therefore clear: maximum output, maximum time at the beach. French people are always on strike. Oh wow, vindicated. Striking in France is not a bug, it's a feature. We do shower though, I'm glad we cleared that up. Baguettes everywhere? Absolutely, guilty as charged. And wine? Yes. Although beer is competing with it. And finally, rich food without Americans' level of obesity. Smaller portions, more walking, fewer snacks, and perhaps the calories are fried away by the cigarettes. So some stereotypes are wrong, some are exaggerated, and some are simply accurate cultural intelligence. But there's one French influence you probably underestimate: You just didn't know it. Do you speak French? The answer is yes, you do. You just pronounce it very creatively. French is spoken by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. It is an official language across many countries. And many people speak French without even knowing it. Despite appearances, our cultures, traditions, values, ambitions, and differences are remarkably familiar. Congratulations! You just understood a sentence built entirely from French vocabulary. A huge share of English vocabulary comes directly through French. Why? 1066, William the Conqueror arrived in England, won at Hastings, and the English aristocracy spent the next few hundred years speaking French. The result is that English often has a Germanic everyday word and a more formal French-derived one. You ask a question, but you inquire. You start something, but you commence it. You raise a cow in the field, but when it reaches the table, suddenly turns into beef. Because the English-speaking peasant raised the animal, and the French-speaking aristocrat ate it. Some aspects of the class system have survived even in the vocabulary. Art, literature, language, fashion, food. We have spent centuries exporting culture, sometimes even when nobody ordered it. This is probably France's most successful form of power. Not military power, not economic power, cultural power. Art, museums, haute couture, literature, music, cinema. Rodin, Louvre, Versailles, Aznavour, and yes, obviously Daft Punk. Because French cultural continuity runs naturally from Louis XIV to two men dressed as robots. The important point is that France has long regarded culture not merely as an entertainment, but as a part of national prestige. Culture is something reproduced, preserved, subsidized, and occasionally lecture other countries about. We gift it too, like a certain Lady Liberty you might have heard of. Yes, she too was born in France, before being assembled in the US. But there is a small problem with talking about French culture in the singular. There really isn't one France. There are several Frances. France is fundamentally diverse, and you can see it in almost everything. North and South, Atlantic, Mediterranean, Germanic and Latin influences, butter in the north, olive oil in the south, beer country, wine country, rugby country, football country, and perhaps the most strategically important dividing line of all, potatoes in the north, tomatoes in the south. Even the French language reflects this mixture, largely Latin vocabulary, but with significant Germanic influence. France sits at a crossroads. Northern Europe meets Southern Europe. Atlantic Europe meets Mediterranean Europe. Continental and maritime influences overlap. So when foreigners ask, what are the French like? The correct answer is, which French? And historically, that question was even more literal, because for most of French history, people across France did not even speak the same language. This map is a useful reminder that the France we know today was not born culturally uniform. Today, these traditional dresses are not worn anymore, but the different cultures remain. Breton in the west, Basque in the southwest, Flemish in the north, Alsatian in the east, Corsican, Occitan across much of the south, and many regional forms of French in between. For centuries, a farmer from Brittany and a farmer from Provence could both be subjects of the King of France and not be able to engage in a conversation. Modern France was therefore not discovered, it was patiently constructed. The state, the army, public schools, road, waterways, and common language turned very different regions into one political nation. And that helps explain a French instinct that sometimes looks strange from abroad. The belief that the republic should create a common public identity above local, ethnic, or religious differences. And nowhere is that instinct more visible or more misunderstood than in that very French word, laïcité. This is one of the biggest cultural differences between France and the United States. Both countries believe in separation of church and state, but we arrived there through a very different path. In America, religious freedom was largely about protecting religion from the state. In France, the historical problem was also protecting the state from the political power of religion. For centuries, French rulers struggled over control of the church. The revolution then attacked its political and economic power. And in 1905, church and state were formally separated.
So American secularism tends to say the state should not interfere with the religion. In France, we would say religion should also remain outside the state. That's why something perfectly normal in American day-to-day life, a politician publicly invoking God, for instance, can feel unusual in France. In God we trust. That is completely normal here. Put that on a banknote or a building in France and half the country would immediately organize a demonstration. And the other half might just join because they heard there was a demonstration. The key point is that laïcité is not supposed to mean hostility towards personal religious belief. It reflects a historical suspicion of religion as political and social power. You don't have to agree with the French model, but without history, it's difficult to understand it. And this brings us naturally to the next course, because I know repeatedly use the phrase because of history. So perhaps it is finally time to explain what happened. Unfortunately, quite a lot happened. Here we go. 2,000 years of French history, and I have about 10 minutes. Historians in the room, I do apologize. Everyone else, remain seated and buckle up. We are going to move quickly and we are going to miss a lot of things. So where do we begin? Not with France, because for most of history, France did not exist yet. So let's start with the prequel. Before France, there was Gaul, but the real Gauls were not one unified nation. There were many Celtic peoples. Then the Romans arrived. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, and for roughly 5 centuries, it became part of the Roman world. The Roman legacy is fundamental. Our language is Latin-based. Our laws, cities, road, Christianity, and political culture were profoundly shaped by Rome. Then Rome collapsed, and Gaul became what military planners would call a mess. Franks, Visigoths, Burgundians, and other kingdoms competed for the territory. Eventually, one Germanic people did rather well, the Franks, and they gave us something important, our name. Fast forward to Charlemagne, he built an empire covering much of Western Europe. Then, in the finest European tradition, his descendants inherited and immediately divided. In 843, the Carthaginian Empire split. The western part becomes West Francia. Now we begin to see the shape of France. That is not yet modern France, but the claim to unite a whole empire is more or less gone. And notice something else on this map. France and Germany are essentially emerging from the breakup of the same empire, which makes the next 1,000 years of Franco-German dispute feel like a very long family feud. There is only one problem. Calling something your kingdom does not mean ruling it. By 987, the Capetian dynasty begins. Look at the map. You can't even see the tiny bluish part that the king controls. That would be essentially Paris. The king of France sits at the top, while powerful dukes and counts control enormous territories. That's the rest of the map. So the central story of medieval France is not territorial expansion, it's state building. For centuries, French kings gradually expand their royal domain, subdue great feudal lords, and extend the authority of Paris, and that's the purple part. Can you spot the green part at the bottom left? That's something the English king inherited through a wedding. Do you know the only thing that is more expensive than a wedding? A divorce. In 1152, Aliénor of Aquitaine divorces the king of France and marries Henri Plantagenet, the future king of England. And with that wedding, an enormous part of France effectively falls under the control of the English crown. 2 centuries later, another French woman enters English politics. Isabelle de France becomes part of a dynastic chain that gives the English king a claim over the throne of France. And that claim ignites the 100 Years' War, which naturally lasted 116 years. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, not our finest sequence of stuff, right? In theory, the English claim to the throne of France is stronger. In theory, the English king wins the war. But because we don't live in theory, things get messy. And in comes the third woman, Joan of Arc, a teenager from Lorraine who helps restore French confidence and becomes a symbol of national resistance. By 1453, the English have been pushed out of almost all of the English territories. So now the King of France turned to the last great obstacle to royal power, Burgundy. A few years later, the Duke of Burgundy dies and leaves behind one underage daughter. She happens to marry into a family you might have heard of, the Habsburg. In the 16th and 17th century, France faces this powerful dynasty. You don't have to have completed CGSC to see the problem. Habsburg power surrounds France. Spain to the south, territories to the north through the Burgundian inheritance, and to the east with the Holy Roman Empire. So French strategy becomes about breaking this encirclement. That is why Catholic France, headed by a cardinal, eagerly supported Protestant powers during the 30 Years' War. Religion matters, and knowing your enemy matters more. By the late 17th century, France has largely broken that encirclement. After a long war, a nephew of the French king inherits Spain and its empire. Finally, France gets rid of its problem and becomes everyone else's problem. France and Britain compete then in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and the oceans. This is no longer simply a European contest. This is a struggle for world power. And here's where American history enters our story. France supports the American Revolution. Not exclusively, because we had suddenly discovered an irresistible passion for Republican liberty, mostly because we really dislike the British. And sometimes the enemy of my enemy becomes the United States of America. Then comes the French Revolution, Napoleon, and another attempt at European dominance. You'll hear all about this year, so let's skip to Waterloo. Napoleon's fall solves the French Revolution for about 15 minutes. Americans have had one famous revolution, very efficient. You did it once and kept the Constitution. We prefer an iterative process. 1789, revolution, then empire. 1815, how about a monarchy again? 1830, another revolution. 1848, how about another revolution? Then another republic, then another empire, then 1870, defeat, another revolution in Paris, and finally the Third Republic. At this point, France has tried monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, again, empire again. Underneath all these regime changes, something remained, though remarkably constant. French state kept becoming stronger. And that is really the thread running through everything we have just seen. Let's try to make a sense of this mess. One line of operation, one line of effort. On top, France against its European competitors. England, Spain, Austria, Britain, Germany. The opponent changes. The strategic problem remains how to prevent another power from dominating France or Europe. And underneath, Paris against France. The monarchy extends the royal domain, breaks powerful vassals, enforces religious unity, breaks the political power of the nobility. The revolution abolishes regional privileges. The republic uses school and as a common language to create national uniformity. So France is being constructed in two directions at once. Outwardly through competition, inwardly through centralization. That helps explain modern France, why Paris is so dominant and why the state is so powerful. By the beginning of the 20th century, that long process has produced one of the world's greatest powers. Then, everything changed when the German nation attacked. 1870, 1914, 1940. 3 major Franco-German wars in 70 years, which leads us into a mutual assured depletion. France survives, Germany survives, but Europe destroys an extraordinary share of its own power in the process. In 1945, both countries confront the same reality. If France and Germany continue this cycle, eventually there will be very left to fight over. The solution is revolutionary in a different sense. Stop balancing against Germany and start building Europe with Germany. Coal and steel first, then economic integration, then eventually the European Union. But 1945 brings another uncomfortable reality. The world in which France had been a global imperial power is no more. After World War II, France tries to preserve its empire, and it does not go well. Indochina, defeated in 1954, then Algeria, a very long and violent war ending in independence in 1962. This is a shock. France moves from ruling a global empire to operating in a world dominated by 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Suez Crisis, in particular, delivers a brutal lesson. Even Britain and France combined cannot act against American opposition. Which brings us to another interesting relationship. 249 years of Franco-American friendship. The relationship begins with the American Revolution. France provides military support, naval power, money, weapons, and Lafayette. Then, only a few years later, we have the quasi-war. So the pattern is established very early. France? Yeah. Easy France? Nah. Then comes the Louisiana Purchase. American troops arrive in France in 1917. United States helped liberate France in 1944. The Marshall Plan helps rebuild Europe and France. And then Suez, where the US helps France remember that the days of the great power are gone. Then de Gaulle puts France out of NATO. France participates in the Gulf War. We fight together in Afghanistan. And then comes 2003 in Iraq. So what is the pattern here? France and the United States share fundamental interests and values. We have fought together repeatedly, but France also has a deeply rooted instinct to preserve its own freedom of action. So, where does this leave us? A country shaped by centuries of competition, centralized by a powerful state, traumatized by invasion, stripped of its empire, saved twice with decisive American help, but determined never to become strategically dependent on anyone. If you understand the history, you are ready to understand French strategic culture. And now we arrive at the final course, strategy. This is where everything starts coming together. Geography gave France a position at the crossroads in Europe and territories around the world. History gave us centuries of great power competition, invasion, alliances, victories, and defeats. And the result is a strategic culture with an unusual combination of characteristics. We are firmly Western, firmly European, firmly allied, and yet slightly obsessed with being able to do things ourselves. Richelieu, Napoleon, de Gaulle would probably agree in one principle. France should remain master of its own decisions. But before I explain French military power of boxes, numbers, and arrows, let's watch the army actually wield it.
Merci, il s'agit d'une mise en scène à la base qui est proche non pas de H1N1.
This is the cinematic version. Now comes the CGSC version. The slide is deliberately dense. You are field grade officers. I will assume you can look at numbers without adult supervision. What matters is the overall picture. France maintains a small but full spectrum military. The army has 118,000 active duty personnel and 23,000 reservists. Navy has more than 40,000 active personnel like the Air Force. And the defense budget shown here is 62 billion euros. But capabilities matter more than mass. France operates Rafale combat aircraft, nuclear-powered submarines, modern frigate Leclerc tanks, and a single nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And behind all of this is something strategically important. France retains a substantial domestic defense industry that aims at producing almost everything locally. That does not make France self-sufficient in everything, but it gives the government a high degree of freedom of action. France does not try to build a smaller version of the US military that would be suicidal. The objective is to maintain enough capabilities across the spectrum to enter first, act independently if necessary, and integrate with allies. And if you remember the geography slide from the beginning, you already know why France needs forces capable of operating far from Europe. Because France itself extends far from Europe. Remember my question from the beginning? With which country does France share its longest land border? French forces are permanently stationed in French Guiana, the Caribbean, Réunion, Mayotte, Polynesia, New Caledonia. They defend French territory and French citizens. And at the same time, France contributes to European collective defense, forward land forces in Romania and Estonia, air policing, NATO maritime groups. But there is more. There are strategic partnerships, particularly in Africa and in the Middle East. And finally, global power projection and military cooperation into the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf of Guinea. So France is trying to do several things simultaneously. Defend the homeland, contribute to NATO security, protect overseas territory, maintain strategic partnerships, and preserve the ability to project power globally. That gives us the central dilemma of France's defense strategy. If your resources are limited, where do you put them? This is the dilemma in one picture: Tahiti or Warsaw, Europe or the world. Nothing new here. We had the same problem back in the 18th century. On the right, Europe. Russia's war against Ukraine has brought territorial defense and NATO's eastern flank back to the center of French military planning. France has obligations to its European allies. But look the other way. France is also an Indo-Pacific nation. It has territory, citizens, an enormous maritime zone and strategic interests there. So if France concentrates everything in Europe, it risks abandoning its global interests. And if it spreads itself globally, it risks lacking mass for a major war in Europe. For the United States, global presence is difficult. For France, it is difficult on a budget. That makes prioritization absolutely central. So how does France actually try to reconcile these competing commitments? Rather than give you another map, let's see what a global posture looks like in practice. The ambition is global, the resources are limited. The concept that tries to bridge that gap has a name: strategic autonomy. Let me start with what strategic autonomy does not mean. It does not mean we don't need NATO. It does not mean we don't want to work with the United States. And it certainly does not mean France can fight alone. Strategic autonomy means something much more practical: the ability to understand, decide, and act without being completely dependent on somebody else's permission or capabilities. This slide breaks that into 4 components. First, autonomy of assessment. You need your own intelligence capabilities to see and understand the situation for yourself. If your ally provides you entire picture of reality, your decision is made by your ally. Second, autonomy of decision. The political leadership must retain the ability to say yes and no. Third, autonomy of action. If you decide to act, you need enough military and industrial capability to make that decision credible. And finally, nuclear deterrence. That ultimate guarantee that France cannot be coerced on matters affecting its vital interests. Remember Suez? France does not seek independence from its allies. France seeks the ability to choose its dependence. Allies, definitely, but not aligned. And that brings us back to where we started, because French strategy is not really understandable through the defense budget alone. It is the product of geography, economics, culture, and above all, history. So, 45 minutes later, what should you remember? Hopefully not every number, definitely not every French king, and probably not the 258 cheeses. Remember the map. France is European, Atlantic, Mediterranean, and global. Remember the economy, large enough to support serious capabilities, but not large enough to avoid difficult choices.
Remember the culture, a country that celebrates liberty, equality, fraternity, usually while arguing about all 3. Remember the history. France was slowly built by a powerful central state, while competing for centuries with whoever happened to be the strongest power in Europe. And then remember the consequence. France remains an ally that places enormous value on freedom of action. Because history taught us that alliances change, threats change, power changes, and nations remain responsible for their own survival. There is one old line from a French school book. You shall love France, because nature has made her beautiful and because history has made her great. Maybe you disagree. Maybe I didn't tell you everything. You don't have to believe me. Actually, I don't want you to believe me. I want you to explore France and see for yourself.
We thank Major Allegre for the amazing presentation, and it was a pleasure to learn more about our world through this culturally significant on this global stage. And we also thank you for being there at the beginning of our country when we needed you most. On behalf of the International Military Student Division and the entire Security Cooperation Enterprise, we thank you for letting us know more about your world. For your exceptional effort, we present to you today the coveted CGSC Foundation Coin of Excellence. Please join me in another round of applause for our strategic partner from the Republic of France, Major Charles Henri-Marie Allegre. The International Military Student Office would like to recognize our very own Fort Leavenworth Commissary for yet again helping us support this Know Your World. And we also thank our CGSC, ATSD, and PAO teams for being here to support the opportunity for us to have this engagement and also to stream and capture in our DVID site. We also would take a moment to thank the student ambassador who's up in the booth, who's driving today for his international officer, Captain Promotable Cody Brown, and his staff group 2 Bravo. Where you at? Thanks for helping Charles in his Know Your World France presentation. It was an absolute success. We look forward to seeing you all at our next AY27 Know Your World presentation, where we will invite our strategic partner from the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, and September 23rd. At this time, please do exit to the rear of the auditorium to the Ardor Atrium to meet Major Allegre and his family and enjoy a sampling of his country's most excellent cuisine. Have a very blessed day, and merci beaucoup.